Welcome to your fifth commencement address for the class of 2020. We are very grateful to have Rohan joining us today and speaking to all of you. Rohan comes with an extensive experience in government affairs and advocacy with consultancies as well as corporates. And as of earlier this year, he's taken over as country head for ByteDance. Rohan, thanks so much for joining us for your
Comments,
content.
not ByteDance, Helo at ByteDance.
Right.
ByteDance has many brands, yeah.
Well, for your context, Rohan, the class graduates by the end of this month, and they'll be joining various PR firms as their first careers in PR. So we are very grateful to you for speaking to them and sharing your words of advice as this group joins the world of PR. So over to you.
Hemant, thank you very much. And Amit, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak with the graduating class. And many congratulations to all of you. As I hear and understand from Amit, you all have been placed. So this should be exciting onwards and upwards. I'm going to do a couple of things in this session. And I really wanted to make this as interactive as possible, because I think the idea is I don't want to preach to the choir, because you all understand the intricacies of how PR works. What I'm going to try and do is, and mostly from my personal experience, I'm going to try and segue a little bit from public relations to public affairs. And it's been very interesting for me. I'm still learning, and this is it's a complicated space to say the least. Just to start with, we're all going through a fairly tremendous storm in all of our lives, and all of us are in it together. But one of the things I hear very often is we're all still in different boats. So it makes things a little difficult sometimes. It makes things interesting. But as you're about to set foot into the corporate sphere, I think it's very important to understand really, and public relations is something that you do well, but also the whole intersection or the interlocking of public affairs with public relations is something that in my career I've seen movement. I actually started working with a PR firm called Perfect Relations way back into the past. But that to me was a very, very exciting start. And I'll try and walk you through some high level areas and concepts, but more so I'd love to get your questions, and hopefully I'm able to give you the right answers as you get into this very, very exciting space. So here's really one of the things that when Amit had reached out and we were speaking was what and how is really more for public relations, and what's that real more got to do with public relations, and what are some of the tenets which I think are broader from PR. So as I was thinking through it, and basis how I think through a lot of assignments that I've done in the past on public affairs, is there's obviously a huge expansion when it comes to stakeholders. So rather than media being your stakeholder, I think that ambit widens significantly. There's also a widening in terms of society and the impact you're able to make in the society. And I think that's something that I take very personally as I approach difficult questions, but try and make sure that you're making an impact at the last mile. And I think that's important. The commonality of public, obviously, in both of the spaces is interesting. And I think it's at the heart of the discussion also in how you deal with public, and therefore how you strategize to build more engagement with public. Policy is an interesting construct because it's fairly institutional in the way it's built up. It also is fairly nuanced in the way policy is constructed, and which is why all of these constituents make up for something which you should think of, and I think very often, is you're making a long-lasting institutional impact to how society works and how society could potentially work differently, hopefully for the better. Like I said earlier, I think the institutional aspect is important, and there is nothing that I've felt a greater thrill about in seeing a policy being enacted by the government, which you have played a small part in or contributed to. And again, this is a long burn. It's typically not something that happens overnight, and which is why public policy or public affairs or corporate affairs, as you might choose to call it, is really more long lasting. So the process is much longer. And there's a wider gamut of institutions that we work with. So which again brings in its respective challenges, because the way you understand Indian bureaucracy or Indian politics, the one thing that we all know is that none of them are subject matter experts. And increasingly, as public policy discourses or public affairs discourses become more important, it's absolutely critical to be able to be an expert at something. And usually it should be something which you're really passionate about. Uh, I plucked something from a book I was reading at some point in time, which is on Golda Meir, who was one of, I think, the fourth prime minister of Israel. And to me, the whole aspect of putting your heart instead of your head in how people conduct public affairs really encompasses all of the 5 or 6 areas that I'd put forward, because that really brings your passion to the table. And that is something that is not just important, in my opinion, for yourself, but also extremely important when you represent the company or the organization that you're working with to external stakeholders, usually the government. And that passion can sometimes be a huge differentiator. So I put more as something which to me was making outcomes resonate in entirety. And that really is very, very important, because you have to approach public affairs from a more holistic standpoint, where you're really thinking about the bigger aspects, but also paying extra attention to the smaller aspects. So the segue really, or the shift that I've personally seen, and something that I keep referencing now and again, is, like I said earlier, public is at the center of the discourse in both of the practices. And that's something that is extremely important to remember. So it is outward engagement, which sometimes becomes the bedrock really of how we work in these assignments. So the shift, or the movement, as you see, the transgression from it being public to actually it becoming people. And when you make that shift, it really brings a certain level of personalization in your approach, because then it's not en masse, it's more specific to certain communities, certain sects, certain cultures, and certain communities. And that becomes very, very interesting and challenging sometimes as you think through strategies of how to move forward. Persuasion obviously becomes extremely important, and which is why the classic US lobbying industry used to work a lot through concepts like unionization, which was working with trade unions. Now in India, trade unions obviously have receded in the last 2 decades or so, but coalitions still become extremely important. And one of the conversations I was having with a very close friend of mine who had strategy for the Tatas was that increasingly in today's time, you will see that citizen advocacy becomes the center of a lot of what we try and do, whether it's through public affairs or it's through public policy. And that's something that personally helps me a lot as I think through some of the challenges we face. And hopefully with having crossed all of these 3 steps into the shift from public relations to public affairs, you're able to impact a policy change, really make a policy change. As I was, running through a couple of documents and reading through some papers, and this is historical, but one of the interesting papers which was done by Monley and McGraw was actually to say that, and I strongly believe that today I think PR has really, really come of age, where intellectually it's something that that professionals like you have chosen the career because it's stimulating. It also has an important aspect. Sorry. Oops. Yep. It also has an important aspect of it being actually decently practicable, where there is respect to the stakeholders you engage with, and there's actually reward with engaging with those stakeholders. There's nothing, I'm sure, that pleases you more than seeing the headline in something that you worked on as a story coming out the way you actually wanted it to come out. And people like Amit and Hemant will know it's legitimately teachable, and which is why SCORE does such a unique and amazing job of bringing together really high quality professionals like you and putting them in the public relations mainstream. Public affairs, honestly, is people haven't been as kind to. And there are various reasons to it, but one of the reasons, obviously, in India is that at the highest level, what the US call lobbying is something that's not legal in India. And which is why it takes the undertone of public affairs or corporate affairs or advocacy, etc. And that brings a certain amount of shroud into the whole space of public affairs, where people think of it as a discreditable activity. It's often murky, lacks the transparency that it should. And these have been areas really because of the way the profession has evolved. It's just been those tags which have been attached to the space. But when you think of public affairs, or when I think of public affairs, I think of it as exactly the converse. Because if there is that kind of a reputation that you build, and there are certain companies which have had challenges in the past because exactly of this, you're not able to really show the accountability that's very important. And accountability, at least what I've seen in the last 2 terms of this government, is something that externally matters a lot. And I think that's something also which can either break the reputation or make the reputation of companies. So extremely critical. However, what is the reality is that the simple thing public affairs tries to do or tries to impact is to shape public opinion. A part of that, as you know extremely well, is through mainstream media and through engagement with media, as you're all very aware of. But the larger ecosystem also means that how do you get citizens to advocate? How do you get communities to coalesce? How do you get stakeholders to come on a table and agree on a common solution? And negotiation in that becomes very critical. So one of the very, very important areas, and I really urge you to think through this and read through negotiations as a concept, because that will help you not just from a public relations standpoint, but also as professionals, it will help you from really sharpening the saw on some of the areas of public discourse, because the line between public relations and public affairs is also seemingly diminishing. And at least I've seen that over the last couple of years, having worked both sides. And lastly, I think it's important, and I say this personally, was that when I was thinking of public policy and when I went to study public policy, one of the big questions that came to me was that while I do everything, go to a great institution and study, will I still get a job, and what's that job going to be? And it's still a question I sometimes ask myself, because the tangibility or the concreteness of your outcomes becomes extremely difficult sometimes to project. But it's also the truth that today most of the large corporations or industries do have a public policy or a public affairs function which they rely heavily on. And I'll come to that in a bit on maybe the next slide. Sorry. Right. So here's some of the things that that I thought of when I was making that shift, and you know, that shift, to be very honest with you, was probably lesser by design, more by default, because the space was just evolving in India towards the end of 2010. And some of the things that I thought through, and those things are coming to fruition as I think through them now retrospectively, is that the ability to make a real long-standing impact is something that will always stay with you in terms of the assignments or the policies you've been able to impact. The role of public, and the term I used earlier, which was around citizen advocacy, is becoming extremely critical in how policy parlays happen in the country and also how politics works in this country. And the real sign of a successful public policy or public affairs practitioner is sometimes to be able to say that, how have you changed the opinion, not just through print or through media, but how have you changed that opinion on ground? And that typically used to be a politician's bastion. But like I said, since politicians or bureaucrats for that matter aren't really subject matter experts, it becomes incumbent on public affairs professionals to bring that expertise into discussion, into dialogues, and into decisions, which is extremely critical when seen on the other side of from the government. It's really a full spectrum to work with. One of the first assignments I really took, and this was right out of business school, was to work with a company called Hindustan Unilever. And the assignment was, I was given a motorcycle and said that you have to cover 3 states in a project that they were doing, which was called Project Shakti, which some of you might be aware of. But it was really Hindustan Lever's cash and carry model. And when you start working the grassroots to start building partnerships, you understand that how important that is to companies' policies and companies' strategies. And the whole spectrum of grassroots to the government is really fascinating because of the spread and the breadth, but also the various elements in the middle, which are extremely important. So again, sometimes the smaller things are more important to pay attention to as you think through a public affairs career, and which can sometimes become exhausting, but I think it's extremely imperative to build that in your construct of being a successful public affairs practitioner. Personally to me, and I took an assignment in 2000 and I think it was early 2012, which was to work with with one of the largest international groups, which was making an HIV vaccine. And it was, the incidence of HIV in India, in a country like India at that point in time, was enormous, including the public health burden our government saw. The irony to the role was that, and I say this now after 10 years out of the job, is that we still don't have an HIV vaccine. And it becomes extremely difficult to start convincing politicians, policymakers, institutions to really fund you when you really don't have a product on the table. And that happens a lot of times also because your imagination is really the basis on which you passionately advocate for certain things, because they aren't the reality now. And status quo is a very comfortable thing for people to be in. But to challenge status quo and to create something out of an imagination or a figment of an imagination is also hugely exciting, because you're really giving birth to something that's new. And I think the idea of giving back to the society is something that's very inbuilt with some of these things, because that really is where you draw the social impact. And I think social impact's is a key tenet to public affairs in the way it's practiced today. And lastly, but also importantly, it's a high risk game. And I'll give you some examples. I've drawn up some examples from my previous roles earlier. It's also a high reward game. And it's a low REM, by which I mean that you actually get very little sleep in how you manage some of these assignments, because it's intensive, but extremely satisfying in how I've seen the journey move so far. I drew up 2 or 3, and these are companies I've worked with in the past. And I put up these consciously just because it might be important to you, for me to contextualize this for you. And so while all of this academia and slides is great, to give you a real world example might help you a little bit more in understanding or appreciating some of the rigor that comes with public affairs. Like Hemant introduced me earlier, one of the assignments that I took up was with a company called APCO. APCO was probably India's one of the first public policy or public affairs firms as they positioned themselves, including having done work at that point in time for the present Prime Minister, then Chief Minister of Gujarat, in setting up something called Vibrant Gujarat, and many other such assignments. But really the reason I put this out was that one of the things and this was my first day of joining APCO, I remember, is a client who came to us, which is a company which is the world's leader in newborn screening. And the idea was very simple, that if you could screen a child between 6 to 12 weeks of the birth of a child for close to about 2,000 birth defects, there's a very, very high possibility that you could actually make an attempt to ensure that the child is birth defect free. And that really changes the life of a child if done properly or institutionalized properly by the government. Now, one of the things the company at that point started doing was creating the standard stakeholder maps, trying to see who we could engage with. But what we did eventually was we flipped it around a little bit in terms of the mandate that was given to us. And what we started doing was we really took 3 or 4 states as pilot states and started engaging with the governments there and saying, we'll do a couple of things for you. One is we created a consortium really of key government stakeholders and took them to about 2 or 3 different countries across the world to understand how this was making a difference in other countries. Now, India, unfortunately, is one of the countries where you see the least or the lowest spending per capita GDP on healthcare. And today we are seeing, the situation we are in, unfortunately, is a very glaring testament to that lack of investment. And what we did was we created a sister city program amongst 3 cities in the US, 2 cities in Europe, and 4 Indian cities. And it took us about 2 years, but what we did at the end of 2 years was that, in partnership with government hospitals, which usually face a lot of ire from public just because of their lack of facilities or lack of institutional infrastructure, we actually created specialized labs in these 2 or 3 or 4 government hospitals called the Center of Excellences for Newborn Care. And that was something that was inaugurated by the state governments. But when I left the company many years later and I met a friend of mine who used to run this company, the numbers of children, which went into thousands, who were impacted by this program, is just something that makes you feel so one indebted and so humbled in terms of what impact you're able to make. So I just wanted to draw an example to say that it's not always sitting across the table with the government writing policy papers or drawing out stakeholder engagement maps. It's really making a difference at the last mile. And I think you should think about it from a human mindset and really where you can make that difference. The other example is even more interesting was I spent a fair part of 5 or 6 years at a company called Mastercard, which is also a company which has one of India's finest global CEOs, Ajay Banga. And the time I joined Mastercard was 2014, and that was also the time when this new government was elected. One of the first policies that this new government put out was a policy you might be aware of, which was called Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, which was really, the objective really was to create 250, 300 million new bank accounts for underbanked India. And that went on to the Guinness World Records and was registered as the highest number of bank account openings. But if you simplistically look at it, it was really providing an identity to these citizens who weren't included in the financial ecosystem or the financial mainstream. The issue with that for a foreign company like Mastercard at that point in time was that Mastercard wasn't a part of the whole process. And it was given to a local incumbent called NPCI, which has a product called RuPay. Now, this was taken up at the most senior-most levels in the company, and there was a lot of hue and cry on how we could be left out of such a huge flagship program of the government, and there was clear nationalism, etc. And the two things that came to me, and I'd just taken up the role, so I was a little hesitant to stick my neck out, but sometimes you just got to do what's right. And what I advised them at that point in time was to say, hey, listen, guys, even if you open financial accounts for 250, 300 million people, which really should be the job of the government, do you think people will start using them automatically? Because India is a 95% cash economy. So just by creating bank accounts doesn't necessarily mean that we were losing out in business. It was really a social objective that the government had. So to confuse a social objective with a commercial objective, I think is wrong thinking at the start of it. What we started doing then was we actually flipped the whole discourse internally. And after a fair bit of analysis, what we saw was that Indians really, and even people like you and me, our definition of digital payments, at least till recently, used to be let's walk to an ATM and let's pull out cash from the ATM and we're done. And that is counted as a digital transaction. Historically, since 2008 or 2009, Mastercard didn't have access to the Indian ATM network, which meant that even though you and me went to our ATMs and we pulled out cash using our Mastercard or Visa or whichever other product, at the end of the day, Mastercard didn't make the money on that because there was a local incumbent at the back of it who really switched the transactions and made the money. So from a commercial standpoint, where we started rebalancing our energy was really to say that while the government is fulfilling its social objective of creating financial inclusion at the last mile, if our interest is to also commercially have a greater share in the financial ecosystem in India, we should focus on opening up the ATMs. And I still remember it was Governor Raghuram Rajan at that point in time. And we again spent a good year and a half trying to work with the government to ration on various things, including how if they were creating a risk by having a single point of failure, because if that system went down, all of our cards would get compromised. And post a year and a half, we actually got a favorable regulation from the RBI, which meant that in the stroke of a policy diktat that the government put out, Mastercard got back 70% of their business, because that's really where Indians used to transact. And to me, that was a huge win in terms of how we rebalanced our priorities, how we didn't always make the government the scapegoat, and we actually found a way to partner with the government. And in the process, we also had a huge commercial impact to our bottom line in the business. And the third example I put here, which is probably the most controversial, but is important for you to know in all transparency, is my last assignment before I took over this role at Helo was with a company called Juul. And this is a case of how public policy goes really bad. And Juul is, for those of you might not know, is the world's largest electronic cigarette company. And the mission was very simple. The mission was to say, we want to change the lives of 1 billion smokers across the world because it was proven that electronic cigarettes, through various scientific research, is about 95% safer than cigarettes. And India has close to about 250, 230 odd million smokers. So as somebody who was a former smoker also, there was a lot of passion in trying to do something which could make a difference to lives where 60% of cancers in India happen because of cigarettes. And we again started working with the government and trying to create a lot of good scientific research, a lot of evidence-based policy. But sometimes the narrative is just so wrong, because this company started off in the US selling electronic cigarettes to children or to teenagers. And this is where I think it becomes relevant to public relations, is because we were not able to manage or control the narrative from the US. Plus, there was political pressures at that point in time. And I can openly tell you that this was more a Trump versus Bloomberg issue, where Bloomberg was really pushing strongly against electronic cigarettes because it also gave him a foothold into the Democratic stronghold. And you're seeing that he's expanding some of those programs now. And in India, we just didn't understand how we could control that narrative. And it got so bad, including when Prime Minister Modi went to the US and met Michael Bloomberg, that for the first time in the history of India, there was a consumer product like Juul, which was banned through an ordinance, which actually the President of India signed. So this is really a case where if the narrative is not managed carefully, things can go really wrong. So this is really where the strength of public relations professionals like yourselves is hugely important, because managing, controlling, and building a favorable narrative is going to be absolutely critical to success in public affairs as well. And lastly, without talking too much in detail, I think the first one is very interesting. And this is a good friend of mine who runs a fantastic think tank. And he always talks to me about the 5 horsemen of public policy or public affairs. This is like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And the 5 issues that people like us in public affairs always face, and this is, it's historical, but it's also important for you to know, is ageism. And I've faced this myself, where somebody who has more gray hair or who has more experience will always be given preference. And that's not something that necessarily works as being the youngest country in the world. So I think age is just a matter of perception also sometimes. And increasingly, we're seeing that change significantly. And you're seeing a lot of young people like yourselves coming into the space of public policy and public affairs. And it thrills me to know and to see young people who are enthusiastic about making a difference come in. So that's one. Second one's nepotism. And nepotism, like, because somebody is my uncle or somebody is my friend, I will get a certain preference over, somebody who doesn't have a godfather in the government or in the industry. And again, I think that's something that is a real challenge for us to deal with. But if you are confident of your art and if you're confident of your arguments that you put together as a public affairs or a public relations professional, I think nepotism over a while fades away. And that's something that is something that you should remember, shouldn't be considered as a challenge or something that you're put up against. It's getting better in the industry. I see there are a lot of ladies in the call, and I think sexism is an important thing to call out. And in all fairness, it's something that has existed across, where you typically would think men are more suited to public affairs roles. But again, I've worked with some fantastic women leaders in public affairs and public policy. And I can tell you, because of the compassion that they bring into the role and because of the passion they bring into the role, there is a much greater impact they're able to make in these discussions than the traditional mindset of having a man who's a lobbyist for the company take up public affairs roles. So that's the third thing, which is the third horseman. The fourth one's classism. And this is something we see internally, we see externally. A lot of us sometimes are accused for not being able to speak the Queen's English, not being able to express yourself in English. And one of the reasons I took up the role at Helo was that we today represent 15 languages in India. And I keep saying this to my teams also, is that the regional vernacular economy in India is just so strong and growing. To give you a stat, I think there was a KPMG report which was done last year to say that out of the 550 odd million internet users India has, 75% of them prefer communication through their languages or through their native dialects. And classism comes in various ways. Classism also comes from a fact that because my father has been an IAS officer, I will get preference in working with certain companies. But classism also sometimes means that because I don't speak English to a certain degree, my preference, the preference of a company is more tilted towards communication, towards experts who can speak a language which is common. But that is also again changing, and I encourage my teams all the time to feel extremely comfortable in their skin and how they communicate, which language they communicate in, as long as the message is clear. And the last one is plagiarism. And by plagiarism, I mean that you are never going to get the credit of having changed a policy in the government. It's always going to be the bureaucrat, it's always going to be the minister. And that's fine. I don't see there's any problem with that, because this isn't a game about where you get the credit and who gets the credit. I think it's really an approach where who has made the difference. And if you feel personally satisfied with what you've been able to impact, I think that's a very strong takeaway. So my personal preference is to not work or not get too worked up with if you don't get the credit, which rarely ever happens. So I think those 5 horsemen of policy is something which was a very interesting conversation, and I thought I'd share it with you as we speak today. The other couple of things, again, just high level top notes for you to know, is also in the public policy space, because it's gotten reasonably popular. There is a whole concept of a lot of armchair public policy making, where people who are public policy professionals attend industry forum meetings, get into seminars, etc. But if you ask them what really is happening on ground, they're very, very far away from reality. And that to me is a recipe for disaster. If you really want to be a public affairs professional who will make a difference, it's really important to get your feedback from ground and have your mindset set to realities on ground. And therefore, the armchair policy approach, sadly, doesn't really work anymore. The other thing which I've faced, and it's been a fair question, is that you're always seen as a support function. It's not seen as a P&L revenue function. And I think, again, that approach is something that I don't agree with. And I also think that approach is increasingly changing, because you need to consider yourself as an important constituent of the business who can make a difference to the bottom line of companies. And one of my former bosses actually told me that for him, the CEO of the company necessarily should have at least 30% of public relations and public affairs experience. And that just goes to show the importance of the function, or the increasing importance of the function in the corporate side of the boardroom. So that's the third thing. The other one, which we spoke about a little bit, is it's always a little fuzzy. How do you measure public affairs, and really what's the real impact you can make? And there are a couple of things that you can easily point to. There are regulatory wins when you can change a policy framework in favor of an ecosystem. And again, this is something we must remember is, I have often been in this discussion to say that, oh, but let's get a policy which is favorable for us, but it shouldn't be favorable for our competitor. Policy is not made for a company. Policy is made for the industry. And if somebody was to go and tell you that, you should push back and understand that policy has a much wider impact, and therefore it's not something that you should build your competitive advantage towards. Sure, there are ways that you can create a more affinity for your particular brand or your particular company, but that comes from relationships. Revenue impact is again important. Like I said, core business function, extremely critical to make sure that when you drive policy, you're keeping the bottom line in mind. Having relationships helps enormously, and this takes time to build, but these are also relationships which are built for a reason. And the other approach which a lot of people follow is the approach to cold call and walk into a government official's room without really having a reason to engage, just because these are one of the 10 stakeholders I need to meet. I think it's very important to have a reason to build that relationship. And that's something that I keep reminding myself if you're going into the room with a meeting, for a meeting with a government bureaucrat or a minister, what are the real 3 things you want to walk away with? And having that mindset is extremely critical. And the last one is, which you will understand well, is how you change the reputation of a company. And there have been many, many examples where companies have changed their reputation completely. You'll see something which was a really good case study recently, which I was reading through, what happened at Zoom, with all of the accusations on them for data siphoning, data pilferage, etc. 90% of the government offices still use Zoom. So they did a really, really good number when it comes to the communications, when it came to the strategy, when it came to the messaging that they put out, and this was driven right from the top. And I think that's a very measurable impact, and it's a very considerable impact that the public affairs function there was able to make for the company, led by the CEO. And the last thing I'll end here is what is really the people value proposition? So what's really the proposition that you personally, as your brand, bring on the table for a company? It's not something which is generic. I think it's very, very person specific. But having your personal value proposition built into public affairs or public relations is really, really critical to build your own brand. And that will take you a long way, not just in your career, but will help with the relationships, will help in your thinking, and will really create a position for you in the external world, which is what you get to be identified with. And as you start your career, I think it's very, very important for you to also focus on your personal brand, because that's really who and what you will be remembered by. And not to make it sound grim, but one of my friends at some point told me that think of it as what should be written on your epitaph when you die. And that really left a very lasting impression on me, but that also drove home the point, I guess, which was to say that who do you want to be remembered as? And that's really some of my thoughts around the whole segue from public relations to public affairs, drawing from some of my personal experience. Thank you very much for having me come and speak to the class. I think it's very humbling for me to see a young set of students who I'm pretty certain will go out into the economic workforce and make a huge difference. Two or three things which I sometimes follow as principles myself is one is, and most importantly, is always trust your worth in where you are in the ecosystem. So be very, very sure on what value you bring and never compromise on your own personal value. I think that is something that will take you a very long way. It is something that will get you the right kind of respect from your colleagues and from your stakeholders, but it's also something that will help you in your journey in life as you set out in a fairly tricky new world now. So I think that's one. Two is never be scared to ask a question and say, I don't know. And I think that's very important because we're all not experts at everything. I think it helps our learning curve tremendously when we go out there and we ask questions. Nobody thinks of you as stupid or somebody who doesn't understand. It's a way of learning, but always ask questions, and also do read about what are the right questions to ask, because the right questions asked the right way actually are 90% of a negotiation, which I was talking about earlier. So please always be very, very confident about asking the right kind of questions. The third thing is public relations as an industry at large, because I've worked with the industry, but also I've seen the industry at close quarters. I think journalism by itself is changing significantly with the coming in of digital media, etc. One of the things that two things that I always look at when it comes to good journalism is opinion and the investigative part of the journalism. And I think there's a lot of respect that I have, and there's a lot of respect you should have for people who actually have an opinion in media and people who actually make an effort to investigate the truth in media. And that is something which is important, as the news is something that must be known, and it's something that should be done with both of these metrics in mind. And that's something that helps me a lot to understand the other side of the coin sometimes when I have discussions with friends in the media. And the last thing is, the world's complicated. We are going through a very tumultuous time. It's going to become increasingly competitive. Don't forget to have fun with whatever you do. If you're not having fun with what you do, I honestly think it's going to be more of a headache than a career journey you take. So do take the time, invest the time in yourself, have a lot of fun with whatever you do, because those are really some of the things which will help you keep your mental sanity, but will also help you excel as an individual. And it's infectious. And there will be more people who will get excited with the kind of exuberance that you bring to the table. So do make sure that whatever you do it with your heart and have a lot of fun at doing it. But I really wish all of you the very, very best. If there is a point in time in your careers where I can be of help, even in the smallest way, do reach out. I'll be very, very delighted to be able to help in whichever way. If there is any advice you need, I again will be very happy to help. You can get me on LinkedIn, whichever way is possible. But I can guarantee you that I would be there in whichever shape or form you might need my help or assistance or advice. So thanks very much for this session today.